Hey guys, how is everybody doing? I am the stock investor guy. So I am done with part 4 and part 5 of the book Oil Man. It's the story of Frank Phillips and the birth of Phillips Petroleum, Phillips 66. It's by Michael Wallace and it was published in 1988. The title of the book again is Oil Man, and this is the concluding book review of the book of the part 4 and part 5, which I completed just today. So just some thoughts on the book. It's basically divided into you can say that part 1, 2, and 3. Actually, part 1 and part 2 are more like you see him starting in the world of business. He was a barber, entrepreneur. He marries Jane Gibson. He's introduced into the world of finance by his father-in-law, and then he learns about the oil industry at a World's Fair, and then he gets into the oil business with his brother, Al E. Phillips, and he also has a younger brother named Wade Phillips, and he's also in the oil business. Al E. Phillips and Frank Phillips set up a bank in Oklahoma, and they, they're bankers and they're oil business people. In the end, it turns out that Frank decides to go more for the oil industry and work there, and Ali is more responsible for the banking operations. So that's like part 1, and part 2 is that you see the growth of Frank Phillips as a businessman and growing his business. And okay, guys, thank you. I do apologize. The wind got really, really, really bad, so I'm just going to do a little voiceover here. Basically, what I'm talking about is how Frank Phillips, part 1 and part 2 of the book start. They talk about him starting out. He was an entrepreneur. He was setting up the business, the oil business, with his brother Al E. And they also set up a bank, and I also talk about how Frank Phillips was a risk taker. That's a pattern that I did notice throughout the book. He went against the advice of the board of directors at times. For example, in the late 20s, when he wanted to build a pipeline to transport gasoline, a lot of the board of directors did not agree with him. They told him that that would be not a good idea. And it ended up, guys, that the pipeline that he built was the reason the company was able to make it through the Great Depression years in the 1930s. And that's basically what I was mentioning in this part of the video. And I do apologize for the wind noise, but I'm going to return you back to the regular video. Thank you. All right, guys, so continuing, of course, in 1930s, the Great Depression hits, what's interesting also about when the crash hit, the stock market crash, 1929, in the 1930s and during the Great Depression, Phillips 66 is actually acquiring a lot of companies. Also, in the 1930s, guys, Ali Phillips, who is Frank Phillips's brother and was one of the co-founders of the company, is starting to have like health problems. So he's kind of like a sick guy. He doesn't end up dying until like I think the 40s, but he starts having health problems as early as the early 30s, 1930s, guys. Let's see. During the crash of 1929, October 29th, 1929. Black Tuesday, I believe, Phillips 66 shareholders are urged by the company not to sell their stock. Okay, and again, Frank builds the pipeline to transport gasoline, and he's a risk taker. Okay, and he goes against the advice of his fellow his board members to do that. But it ends up helping the company pull through the company. It pulls through the company through the years of the Great Depression. Okay, guys, and let's see. So, continuing, They have servants in the house. Again, this part 4 and part 5, guys, are, just Frank Phillips living, a philanthropic life. He's rich, and he has servants at his house. He treats his servants like family. Again, Frank Phillips, one thing I noticed in the book is that he's a very generous man to his employees. His employees at Phillips 66 Company and the servants that work for him in his home. He's very generous, man. He treats them like family, okay? And that's very important to do when you're running a company, I believe. One interesting thing that I found is that Frank Phillips in the 1930s also is a friend or an associate of Bernard Baruch, who was an advisor to presidents on economic policy. Bernard Baruch, guys, was kind of like the first Warren Buffett of the early first half of the 20th century. And Bernard Baruch's brother is actually meeting Frank Phillips in France when Frank Phillips goes to France to talk about the oil industry. So I found that a little, very interesting that he knew the Baruch brothers. Okay. Let's see. At the end of 1930, Frank presents a resignation letter to the Phillips 66 board, but they decline this resignation, and Frank Phillips does not leave the company at all. It's just something that he put in the resignation, but the board of directors does not accept that resignation. Another thing that Frank Phillips did, which I find very admirable of a company chairman, is also that he, during the Great Depression years, during the toughest years for the company, Frank Phillips cut his personal salary to $1 a year. Okay, in August 1931, the pipeline that he built was completed, and it helped Frank gain independence from the bankers, because during the 30s, guys, the company needed financing, and so he was indebted to the bankers. But this pipeline that he took a risk on, that all his other board of directors told him not to, was the one that helped him pay off all those debts to the bank. Okay, let's see. There was also a guy in 1935. Well, in the early 30s, guys, there was the bank, since Phillips 66 Company owed so much money to the banks, they put a guy by the name of Judge Beatty to be kind of like a watchdog, to watch Frank Phillips. The bankers wanted to make sure that their investment and their money was safe, so they wanted to protect that, and they set up Judge Beatty, a guy by the name of Judge Beatty, in the first half of the 1930s, to kind of be there as a watchdog and watch over Frank Phillips and the Phillips 66 Company and its operations, and just to make sure that everything was fine. But again, by 1935, they're clear. That pipeline helps them get out of that debt, and Judge Beatty steps down. Okay, in 1935. Okay. Also, one thing concerning his son, Frank Phillips' son is John Gibson Phillips. This guy, he was an alcoholic, and Frank Phillips was very disappointed by his son. He knew that his son was never a contender to take over the company, when he passed on or when he decided to retire. John Phillips, the son of Frank Phillips, is a disappointment to him, and it's something that he struggles with, that Frank Phillips struggles with. It's something that he has a hard time understanding, and he just had a really great disconnect with his son, John Phillips, guys. Also, guys, his friend Will Rogers, he was an Oklahoma native, and he is a friend of Frank Phillips, and he also attended a lot of the parties and get-togethers that Frank hosted at his ranch in Oklahoma. And Will Rogers, guys, was a singer actor, I believe, from back in 20s, 30s, and he was a good friend of Frank Phillips. And Will Rogers dies during the 30s, I believe. Okay, and on April 26, 1938, a guy by the name of K.S. Adams, also known as Boots Adams, was elected president of Phillips 66 Company, and he was one of the youngest presidents of a major corporation in America at the time. What happens with Boots Adams, though, guys, is that even though he's named president of Phillips 66, Frank Phillips remains chairman of the board and chief executive officer. So the book explains that even though Boots Adams is a president of the company, the boss is still Frank Phillips. Okay, so that's how he stays in control of the company. Okay, let me see here. Okay, and then of course, the book starts talking about World War II, and the 1940s, early 40s, and the U.S. entering the war. Frank was a major supporter, along with the company, Phillips 66 Company, of the war effort during World War II. Again, there was a U.S. involvement in 1939. The Germans invade Poland and Czechoslovakia. 1941, there's December of 1941, there's Pearl Harbor. It kind of becomes a history lesson, guys, also, but it's just through the perspective of Frank Phillips and his company. And Frank Phillips was a supporter of World War II and the war effort. Okay. Phillips 66 Company was founded in 1917. It had a net worth of $3 million. And in 1939, the company is worth $226 million. Also, during the parties, Frank Phillips's parties continue, or get-togethers continue at the Woolarook Ranch. He's also a huge collector, guys. He has several museums on the ranch. All the things from like artwork to aviation, just different stuff that he's interested, like a lot of Native American stuff that he's interested in. The museums are in the ranch, and at the end, when before his passing, those museums are open to the public. Okay, let's see. And he actually ends up donating that ranch to the Frank Phillips Foundation. So he donates his ranch, and it also says I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but it also says in Oil Man, the book, that during the end of his life, he gave away 3/4 of his net worth, guys. So Frank Phillips was very, very philanthropic. Okay, his good friend E.W. Moreland dies in 1941. He was the governor of Oklahoma, also an oil tycoon, but who lost his company during that 1930s really bad period to the banks. Okay, and in the mid 1940s, guys, there's some health problems that began for Frank Phillips. His brother Al E. Phillips actually dies on April 16th of 1944 at 67 years old. In 1943, also, guys, Frank Phillips doesn't trust Boots Adams, and he just has an issue with some of the deals that Boots Adams is doing for the company and making. So he kind of overrules him on some of the deals that he wants to put through the company. At the time, it talks about, when Frank Phillips is 72 years old, and Frank realizes at the time it was not some commodity that could be bought, sold, or traded. It was more precious than all the gold, silver, and oil that any person could possess. So he definitely sees that time is leaving, and he has very little time on his hands. I mean, he values time more and more the older he gets. I think that's what we all do. His wife, Jane Phillips, dies on August 31st, 1948. During the late 40s, like 1948, 1949, 50, Frank Phillips withdraws more and more from the company. He kind of lets Phillips 66 slide into the hands of Boots Adams. Frank gave up active management on March 16th, 1949. So as of that date, he was already really sick. He had some gastrointestinal problems, and so he could no longer run the company, and he expressed this in a letter to his board of directors, and at that time they do accept his resignation. On August 23rd, guys, 1950, while he's visiting Atlantic City, New Jersey, Frank Phillips dies at the age of 76 years old. Again, Frank gave away most of his personal wealth, and his son, John Phillips, the guy that was an alcoholic, he dies soon after Frank Phillips dies on January 17th, 1951, at the age of 52, so rather young. His son dies. I also wanted to read part of the back of the book has a timeline of what happens after Frank Phillips dies. On January 19th, Wade Phillips, who's the younger brother, 1964, January 1964, Wade Phillips, the younger brother, also in the oil business, dies. He was 81. Okay, his mistress, Sydney Fern Butler, died in 1968. Let's see, Boots Adams died. The president that Frank Phillips didn't trust. He dies on March 30th of 1975. And all these facts are just on the back of the book. In 1984, 1985, Phillips became the target of two major investor groups attempting hostile takeovers of the company. One was led by T. Boone Pickens, who was actually a former employee of the company, and the other by corporate raider Carl Icahn. T. Boone Pickens recently died, and Carl Icahn, guys, is still around. The book is very interesting, guys. Again, the book is Oil Man, the story of Frank Phillips and the birth of Phillips Petroleum. It's by Michael Wallace, and it was published in 1988. Very interesting book. I'm glad I finished it, and I hope you guys enjoyed this book review. And let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Thank you for watching. I'm the Stock Investor Guy. Have a great day. Bye.